I don't know how to start this, but I need to say it somewhere. My name's Liam, and a few months ago, I thought my life was steady. You know, the kind of life where everything feels like it's in its rightful place. I had a wife, Dolores, who I believed was my partner in every sense of the word. We'd been married for 4 years, and while we weren't the couple writing cheesy anniversary posts or showing off date night selfies every weekend, we had what I thought was something real. Something you could build on. Looking back, the cracks were there if I had bothered to look. But it's like this with betrayal. It sneaks in through the smallest gaps, doesn't it? At first, things were fine. Then they weren't. Dolores started acting different, distant. It wasn't like she just stopped talking to me, but there was a coldness in the way she did. The little things that used to mean a lot, her hand brushing against mine while passing by, the way she'd roll her eyes at my corny jokes but still laugh, those things stopped. When I asked if something was wrong, she'd shrug it off. She'd say she was tired or stressed from work. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I tried to fix it in all the ways I could think of. I planned a quiet dinner at home one night, just the two of us, and cooked her favorite meal. She barely touched her plate and spent the evening scrolling through her phone. I suggested a weekend getaway to one of her favorite spots, thinking some time away might help us reconnect. She declined, saying she wasn't up for traveling. The more I tried, the more she pushed me away. I just need some space, she said one night, not even looking up as she spoke. I remember sitting there, the words hanging between us, trying to understand what she really meant. By the time the holidays rolled around, I was grasping at straws, hoping for anything to get us back on track. My family has a tradition. Every year, we all gather at my parents' house for a big holiday dinner. It's the kind of thing that's chaotic but comforting. The same old stories get told, the same jokes get repeated, and even though we roll our eyes, it's what makes it special. I thought maybe the familiarity of it all would be good for Dolores. At the very least, I hoped it might pull her out of whatever funk she was in. She wasn't exactly thrilled about going. I remember her standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, saying she'd rather stay home. I convinced her though, telling her how much it would mean to my parents if we both came. She gave in, but her mood didn't improve. She barely spoke on the drive there, staring out the window like she was counting the miles until it was over. When we arrived, she put on her polite face, the one she used when she didn't want people to ask questions, but I could see through it. She downed her first glass of wine pretty quickly, which wasn't like her. By the time dinner started, she was on her second, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't even funny. My mom made a comment about how much she was enjoying herself, and Dolores just gave her this tight smile before reaching for another refill. After dinner, my brothers and I headed to the game room to play pool. I thought maybe Dolores had settled in with the rest of the family, but I realized halfway through the second game that I hadn't seen her in a while. It wasn't unusual for people to wander off during these gatherings, sometimes to the kitchen for more food, sometimes to the porch for air, but something about her absence nagged at me. I figured I'd check on her after the game. Then my phone buzzed. It was the home security company, calling to confirm the code for an alarm that had gone off. I kept a notebook with all our passwords and codes in the suitcase upstairs, so I excused myself to go grab it. The bedroom we were staying in was one of the guest rooms, small but cozy, with a quilt my mom had made years ago draped across the bed. When I opened the door, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Maybe Dolores was napping, or maybe she'd stepped out to make a call. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found. I opened the door, and for a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Dolores was there, but she wasn't alone. My young Uncle Ben, someone who had always been the fun uncle, the guy who made everyone laugh at family gatherings, was with her. They were tangled up together on the bed, and it was clear as day what had just happened. The room smelled like sweat and alcohol, and their clothes were scattered across the floor. I froze. My whole body went numb, like the air had been sucked out of the room. For a second, I thought maybe this was some kind of nightmare, and I'd wake up. But no, it was real. I stood there, gripping the doorframe so hard my knuckles turned white, staring at the scene in front of me. Neither of them even noticed me at first. It wasn't until I slammed the door against the wall that they realized someone was there. Dolores scrambled to cover herself with a quilt, her face flushed, not with shame, but with irritation, like I was the one intruding. Ben stammered, trying to come up with some excuse, but the words just died in his throat. He looked at me, his face pale, and for once, the confident, carefree uncle everyone loved didn't have anything to say. I don't remember the exact order of what happened next. It's all a blur of anger, betrayal, and chaos. I do remember yelling. A lot of yelling. My voice cracked as I demanded an explanation, but there was nothing they could say that would make any of it make sense. Dolores didn't apologize. Instead, she told me I was overreacting. "It's not what it looks like," she said, which was laughable considering the evidence was right there in front of me. I stormed out of the room and down the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My family was still gathered in the living room, laughing and sharing stories, completely unaware of the bomb that had just gone off upstairs. I didn't care about keeping it quiet or saving face. I was too angry for that. I marched straight into the middle of the room and shouted. Ben and Dolores were upstairs, in bed together. The room went dead silent. My mom dropped her glass of wine, and it shattered on the floor. My dad stood up so quickly his chair tipped over. My brothers just looked at me, wide-eyed, like they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. And then, as if on cue, Ben came stumbling down the stairs, trying to button his shirt. Dolores followed a few steps behind, clutching the quilt around her like it was some kind of shield. My dad was the first to react. He stepped forward, his face red with fury, and told Ben to get out of the house immediately. My mom was crying, asking Dolores how she could do something like this to me, to our family. Dolores just stood there, silent and stone-faced, like none of it was her problem. That part hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself, the complete lack of remorse. The rest of the night was a blur of yelling, accusations, and stunned silence. My brothers tried to calm me down, but I couldn't sit still. I was pacing back and forth, trying to make sense of how my life had fallen apart in the span of a few minutes. Eventually, Ben and Dolores were thrown out. No bags, no coats, just whatever they had on them. My dad told them they were no longer welcome in his house, and honestly, I felt the same way about my life. When the door slammed behind them, the weight of everything hit me. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding, this was deliberate, cruel, and unforgivable. My marriage, the trust one had in the woman I loved, my relationship with my uncle, it was all shattered. My family tried to salvage what was left of the evening, but the damage was done. Conversations were tense, forced. My mom kept coming over to hug me, whispering how sorry she was. My brother stayed up late with me, offering sympathy in the way only brothers can, half awkward, half heartfelt. Some relatives left early, not knowing what to say, while others stayed and talked in hushed tones around the table. The warmth and laughter that usually filled these gatherings had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. That night I went to bed in the other room. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dolores and Ben. The betrayal spun in my head in circles, and each repetition was deeper than the last. By morning, I knew one thing for sure. This marriage was over. The morning after was like waking up from a nightmare, except the nightmare was still there, staring me in the face. Dolores never came back to the house, not that I expected her to. I packed up what little of her stuff we had brought for the trip and left it by the front door. My dad asked if I wanted to stay longer, but I couldn't stand being in that house another second. It felt tainted, like every room carried the echoes of what I'd seen and the weight of everyone's pity. I told him I needed to head home and sort things out. He nodded and said he understood, though the tightness in his voice told me he didn't know what to say. My mom hugged me so hard I thought she'd break my ribs, whispering again how sorry she was. On the drive back, I had too much time to think. Every memory of my marriage came flooding back, but now they were all warped, tainted by what I knew. I thought about our wedding day, how happy I'd been, and how Dolores had looked at me with what I thought was love. Was it all a lie? How long had she been this person, the one who could betray me so completely? By the time I got home, I knew what I had to do. I grabbed a stack of boxes and started packing Dolores' things. Her clothes, her books, even the little knickknacks she'd scattered around the house to make it feel like ours. I didn't care if it seemed cold or impulsive, I wanted her out of my life. Each box I filled felt like a small victory, a way to take back some control when everything else felt like chaos. I couldn't just let her stuff sit in the garage though. That felt too kind, too easy. So I loaded up my car and drove to the local donation center. They were thrilled to take everything off my hands, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction knowing that someone else might actually appreciate the things Dolores had abandoned. That afternoon, Dolores' parents called. They hadn't heard from her and were worried. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them exactly what had happened. I expected them to defend her, to make excuses, but instead, they apologized. They said they were ashamed of her, that they couldn't believe she would do something so terrible. Her mom cried, and her dad told me if I ever needed anything, I could count on them. That call was harder than I expected. Even though I was furious at Dolores, hearing her own parents disown her in a way was a punch to the gut. I hung up feeling more drained than before. The next day, I went straight to the courthouse and filed for divorce. I didn't want anything from her. Not the furniture we bought together, not the car we shared, nothing. All I wanted was to be done with her. I left no room for reconciliation, no way for her to worm her way back into my life. Once the paperwork was filed, I took one last step. I went online and posted a simple message on a local community page. I didn't name names or go into graphic details, but I made it clear that my wife had been unfaithful, that trust had been broken in the worst way possible. Some people might think it was petty, but for me, it was about warning others. I didn't want anyone else to fall for the same lies I had. When I finally sat down that evening, my house felt strange, empty but also lighter. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Dolores was gone, and while the hurt was still there, I felt like I could start to move forward. In the days following the divorce filing, I kept myself busy, partly to keep my mind from spiraling and partly because there was so much to do. I told my employer about the situation. I work as a translator, and thankfully, they were understanding. They gave me some time to sort out my personal life, though I didn't take much. Sitting around at home with nothing but my thoughts sounded like torture. I threw myself into work, taking on as many assignments as I could. Translation has always been a kind of escape for me. There's something calming about the process of converting words, finding the exact right phrases to carry a meaning across languages. It's precise, methodical, everything my personal life wasn't. But even with the distractions, there were moments when the reality of what had happened hit me like a freight train. I'd be in the middle of a translation project, and suddenly, my mind would wander back to that night at my parents' house. The betrayal, the humiliation, the way Dolores looked at me as if I was the one who had done something wrong, it was all so fresh. The hardest part was the nights. During the day, I could keep myself busy, but when the house was quiet, the weight of everything would settle on my chest. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how someone who once promised to love me could tear my life apart so easily. One night, I went through our old photo albums, the digital ones stored on my laptop, where every trip and holiday was neatly categorized. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was looking for signs, for clues I had missed. Maybe I just wanted to feel something other than anger. But all it did was deepen the sense of loss. The memories were there, frozen in time, mocking me. There was the photo of us at the Grand Canyon on our honeymoon, her smile so wide it looked like it might crack her face. There was the one from our first anniversary dinner, the candlelight making her eyes sparkle. Looking at those pictures, it was hard to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the one who had betrayed me so completely. I closed the laptop and decided right then and there that I couldn't stay stuck in the past. I had to move forward, even if it felt impossible. The first step was letting people around me know what had happened. It wasn't easy. There's something deeply humiliating about admitting your marriage fell apart, especially when infidelity is involved. But I didn't want to hide it or pretend everything was fine. So, I started telling the truth, little by little. My friends were supportive, though some of them were shocked. A couple of them admitted they'd noticed Dolores seemed distant over the past year, but no one suspected it was this bad. One friend even joked, "Man, you really dodged a bullet," which didn't feel great in the moment but was probably true. My family, especially my parents, rallied around me. My mom called every day, checking in, offering to bring over meals or help with anything I needed. My dad, never one for big emotional gestures, just said he was proud of how I was handling things. That meant more to me than I could put into words. The anger was still there, of course, simmering beneath the surface. But alongside it was a growing determination. I wasn't going to let Dolores' betrayal define me or ruin my life. She'd already taken enough. I wasn't about to give her any more power over me. With Dolores out of my life, I threw myself into the business of reclaiming my space. Physically, emotionally, and mentally. The house we shared didn't feel like home anymore. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. The throw pillows she picked out, the pictures we hung together, the mug she always used for her morning coffee. It felt like the walls themselves were stained with her betrayal. I decided the house needed a reset. On a Saturday morning, I grabbed a few trash bags and went room by room, getting rid of anything that reminded me of her. It wasn't just her clothes or the framed photos of us as a couple. I went deeper. The vase she brought back from a trip with her friends? Gone. The books she loved but never actually read? Boxed up and donated. Even the curtains she insisted on that I secretly hated, those came down too. It was strangely therapeutic, almost like I was reclaiming the space for myself. By the end of the day, the house looked emptier but lighter, like a weight had been lifted. Next, I tackled the bedroom. I couldn't sleep in the same bed where we used to share our lives, so I replaced the sheets and mattress entirely. I even rearranged the furniture, shifting the bed to the opposite wall. It wasn't much, but it made the room feel like mine again. Once the house was sorted, I started thinking about my next steps. I'd always had dreams of branching out with my career, maybe moving somewhere new, but I'd put those plans on hold for Dolores. She liked stability, and I wanted to make her happy. Now that she was out of the picture, there was nothing stopping me from chasing those dreams. I started researching opportunities abroad, seeing where my skills as a translator could take me. Europe seemed promising, France in particular. I'd always been fascinated by the language, the culture, the history. The idea of starting over in a place so far removed from everything that had happened here was appealing. In the meantime, I started taking on bigger projects at work. It was a good distraction, something to focus on besides the mess Dolores left behind. My co-workers noticed the change in me. One even joked that I was like a machine, churning through assignments faster than anyone else. What they didn't know was that staying busy was the only way I could keep my mind from spiraling. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. There were moments when the anger and sadness came crashing back, often when I least expected it. Like the time I found an old sweater of hers tucked in the back of the closet, or when I walked past the cafe where we used to have Sunday brunch. Those moments hit like a punch to the gut, but I tried not to let them derail me. I started therapy around this time, something I'd always been hesitant about but knew I needed. Talking to someone neutral, someone who wasn't connected to the situation, helped me unpack the layers of betrayal and figure out how to move forward. The therapist told me healing wasn't a straight line, and some days would be harder than others. She was right, but at least I felt like I had a roadmap now. Bit by bit, I began to see a future for myself. A future without Dolores, without the weight of her lies and betrayal dragging me down. I wasn't there yet, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. The decision to move forward wasn't a switch I could flip overnight, but the more I focused on rebuilding my life, the more I began to feel like myself again. A few weeks after filing for divorce, I made the biggest decision so far. I was going to leave the town I'd lived in my entire life. I had always dreamed of starting fresh somewhere far from the familiar, but I'd shelved those plans for the sake of settling down with Dolores. Now, I realized there was no reason to hold back. I didn't want to be surrounded by the memories of my failed marriage, the whispered pity from neighbors, or the places that reminded me of happier times with her. I put my house on the market and started looking into opportunities abroad. France had always been a place I'd wanted to experience, and my work as a translator made the transition easier to imagine. I reached out to a couple of contacts in the industry, and to my surprise, things moved quickly. A company in Paris expressed interest in hiring me for a long-term contract, handling international clients. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I was uprooting everything, leaving behind the life I'd built for something completely unknown. But that's what I needed. Something unknown, something new. While I waited for the paperwork to go through, I began tying up loose ends. Selling my car was easy. I'd never been particularly attached to it. The house took longer to close, but when it finally sold, I felt like a weight had been lifted. That house was where Dolores and I had built our lives together, but now it felt like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. Packing up my belongings was another strange experience. I realized just how much of what I owned was tied to my past life, to the person I used to be. I kept only the essentials: books, my laptop, some clothes, and a few sentimental items that had nothing to do with Dolores. Everything else, I either donated or sold. I wanted my new life to feel uncluttered, free from the baggage of the past. In the midst of all this, Dolores tried reaching out once. She sent me a text, something vague about how she hoped I was doing okay. I didn't respond. What was there to say? She'd already shown me exactly how much she cared about my well-being. Her parents, on the other hand, called me again. They apologized profusely, as if they were responsible for her actions. They weren't, they couldn't have been, but it was clear they felt the weight of her choices. I thanked them for their kindness and reassured them that I didn't hold any of this against them. When the day finally came to leave, I felt a mix of emotions. Standing at the airport with my suitcase in hand, I looked back one last time at the life I was leaving behind. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I needed to be somewhere where I could breathe, where I could focus on who I wanted to be instead of who I'd been. The flight to Paris felt like the first real step toward freedom. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in months, I felt a spark of excitement. I wasn't just running from the past, I was running toward something new. Arriving in Paris was surreal. The city was alive in a way that felt almost overwhelming, but it was exactly what I needed. Everything was so different from what I had known. New faces, new streets, new sounds. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't haunted by familiar places that carried the weight of betrayal. The company I signed with had set me up with temporary housing in a small but cozy apartment near Montmartre. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first night, I stood on the balcony, watching the city lights stretch out into the horizon. There was a quietness in my chest, a kind of calm I hadn't felt in months. Work started the following week, and it didn't take long for me to settle in. Translating for international clients was challenging but rewarding. Every project felt like a puzzle, and I loved the satisfaction of piecing it all together. My co-workers were welcoming, and though the language barrier was tough at first, I picked up enough conversational French to hold my own. I threw myself into exploring the city during my downtime. Paris felt like a maze, with its winding streets and hidden courtyards, but I didn't mind getting lost. I'd wander for hours, stumbling across street performers, tiny cafes, and parks tucked between buildings. It was all so vibrant, so full of life, that it was impossible not to feel inspired. One afternoon, while sitting at a cafe near the Seine, sipping on an espresso, I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't thought about Dolores all day. It wasn't just that I was distracted, it was that, for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. That's not to say I was completely over everything. There were still moments when the memories crept back, usually when I least expected it. I'd hear a song we used to listen to or see a couple holding hands, and for a second, it would all come rushing back. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Not long after settling in, I made a friend at work, a woman named Eva. She was a translator like me, specializing in German and Spanish, and had moved to Paris from the UK about a year ago. We clicked immediately. There was something easy about talking to her. She was funny, curious, and had this infectious energy that made everything feel lighter. Eva had a knack for making even the mundane seem exciting. She'd invite me to random events, a jazz concert in a tucked-away club, a weekend market with the best crepes in the city, or a late-night walk along the Seine. Spending time with her reminded me that life could still be joyful, that there were still good people out there. At first, I was cautious. After everything I'd been through, the idea of letting someone new into my life felt risky. But Eva didn't push. She seemed to understand I was still finding my footing. She told me about her own reasons for moving to Paris, how she'd left behind a life in the UK that felt too small for her dreams. The more we talked, the more I realized we had something in common. We were both searching for something more, something bigger than the lives we'd left behind. As the weeks turned into months, Paris started to feel like home. I was finding a rhythm in my new life, and a big part of that was thanks to Eva. We spent more and more time together, and it wasn't long before she became my closest friend in the city. What struck me most about Eva was her approach to life. She had this adventurous spirit that made everything feel less heavy. She wasn't one to dwell on the past, and that rubbed off on me. It wasn't that she dismissed what I'd been through. She just had a way of showing me that there was still so much to look forward to. One evening, we went to a rooftop bar she'd heard about. The view was incredible. Paris stretched out before us, with the Eiffel Tower glowing in the distance. As we sipped our drinks, Eva asked me about my dreams, the ones I'd shelved when I got married. At first, I didn't know how to answer. I'd spent so long trying to build a life with Dolores that I hadn't thought about what I wanted for myself in years. But as I sat there, staring out at the city, I started to remember. I told her about my childhood dream of traveling the world, of waking up in a new place every week, meeting new people, and learning their languages. It was something I'd always thought about but never seriously pursued. I'd told myself it wasn't practical, that it was something for other people, not me. Eva listened, her head tilted slightly as she took in every word. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Why not? What's stopping you now?" The question stayed with me long after that night. Why not? I had no ties holding me back anymore. My work was flexible, and I'd already made a huge leap by moving to Paris. For the first time, the idea of chasing that dream felt possible. Eva and I started spending weekends exploring nearby cities. We'd hop on trains and visit places like Lyon, Strasbourg, and even a quick trip across the border to Belgium. Traveling with her was effortless. She was the kind of person who could make a missed train feel like an adventure rather than a setback. Somewhere along the way, our friendship began to shift. It wasn't something we talked about or even acknowledged at first, but there was a growing closeness between us, an ease that went beyond just being friends. One night, after a day spent wandering the streets of Bordeaux, we found ourselves sitting on a bench by the river, watching the city lights reflect on the water. Eva was telling me about her dream of opening a small language school someday, a place where people could come together and share their cultures. As she spoke, I couldn't help but notice how her eyes lit up, how passionate she was about the idea. And in that moment, I realized something. I was happy. Not just content or distracted, but genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been in years. The realization caught me off guard. I hadn't thought I'd be capable of feeling that way again, not after Dolores. But here I was, sitting next to someone who made the world feel full of possibility again. It wasn't until a quiet afternoon in Paris that everything between Eva and me began to shift in a way we couldn't ignore. We'd planned to meet for a picnic near the Luxembourg Gardens, something casual like we often did. She brought a basket filled with baguettes, cheese, and fruit, and I grabbed a couple of bottles of wine from a local shop. We spread out a blanket under a tree, watching people stroll by as we shared food and stories. It was easy, as it always was with her. But this time, something felt different. There was a warmth in her laughter that lingered, a softness in her smile that made my chest tighten. At one point, as she was telling a story about an embarrassing mishap during one of her first translation jobs, she reached over and brushed a crumb off my sleeve without even thinking about it. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't. That tiny, unintentional moment opened a door I hadn't even realized was there. I started noticing other things. The way her hair caught the sunlight, the way her voice softened when she was deep in thought, the way she made me feel like I was the only person in the world when she looked at me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold, the air between us seemed to change. We were sitting closer than usual, our knees almost touching, and there was a comfortable silence as we watched the light fade. Eva turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what's next, Liam? Like, where you see yourself in a year, 5 years, even 10? The question caught me off guard, but I thought about it for a moment before answering. I told her about my vague plans to keep traveling, to see as much of the world as I could. I admitted that for the first time in a long time, I didn't have everything mapped out, and surprisingly, I was okay with that. When I asked her the same question, she smiled and said, "I don't know. But I think I'm finally in a place where I'm open to whatever comes next." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I wanted to say something, to tell her how much she had come to mean to me, but I hesitated. What if I was reading too much into things? What if I risked ruining the friendship that had become my anchor in this new life? Before I could overthink it any further, Eva leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something there, something unsure but hopeful. I mirrored her movement, closing the gap between us slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. When our lips finally met, it was soft, tentative, but it felt like the world had shifted beneath my feet. It wasn't the kind of kiss that promised grand, sweeping romance. It was something quieter, more meaningful, a spark igniting in the ashes of everything I thought I'd lost. When we pulled back, there was a moment of silence, both of us processing what had just happened. Then Eva smiled, a small, nervous smile that made my chest ache in the best way. "I wasn't sure you'd ever make a move," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I laughed, the sound breaking the tension. "I wasn't sure I could." We stayed there until the stars came out, talking about everything and nothing, the kiss hanging between us like a promise. For the first time since Dolores, I felt like I was stepping into a future that wasn't defined by pain or loss. It wasn't just that I was falling for Eva, it was that she made me believe in the possibility of love again. After that evening in the park, something shifted between Eva and me. We didn't rush into anything, we were both cautious in our own ways, but the connection between us was undeniable. Our friendship had always been natural, easy, but now there was something more. We started spending even more time together, and not just in the carefree, adventurous ways we had before. There were quiet nights at her apartment, cooking dinner together and talking about our pasts. There were early morning walks to grab coffee before work, where the city still felt half asleep. Every moment with her felt meaningful, like I was rediscovering parts of myself I thought I'd lost. Eva had this way of bringing out the best in me without even trying. She'd encourage me to talk about my dreams, pushing me to think beyond the pain of the past. It wasn't that she was trying to fix me, she knew better than to pretend anyone could do that. But she had this gift for reminding me that I was more than what had happened to me. One night, over a shared bottle of wine at her place, she brought up the idea of traveling together. "You've been talking about seeing the world," she said. "Why not make it happen? We could go together." At first, the suggestion seemed too big, too soon. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. Eva wasn't just someone I enjoyed being around. She was someone I could see myself building a life with. The idea of traveling with her, of experiencing the world side by side, felt less like a dream and more like a real possibility. We started planning, saving every extra euro we could. She took on additional freelance projects, and I picked up overtime whenever it was offered. Every spare moment was spent researching destinations, mapping out routes, and fantasizing about the adventures we'd have. During one of our planning sessions, Eva brought up the idea of getting a motorhome. At first, I wasn't sold. I'd always pictured travel as hopping from one city to the next, staying in small hostels or hotels. But the more she talked about it, the more it made sense. A motorhome would give us the freedom to go wherever we wanted, whenever we wanted. It would be our little home on wheels, a space that was entirely ours. By the summer, we had saved enough to make it happen. We found a used motorhome that was a little rough around the edges but had plenty of charm. Fixing it up became our shared project, and in the process, we grew even closer. There was something deeply satisfying about building something together, something that was entirely ours. The day we finally hit the road was one of the happiest I can remember. The motorhome was stocked with everything we'd need for the months ahead, and we had a loose plan to explore the most romantic and picturesque places Europe had to offer. Our first stop was the Loire Valley, with its rolling vineyards and fairy tale castles. We spent days wandering through small villages, sampling wine and cheese, and sitting by the river as the sun set. It was idyllic in a way that felt almost unreal, like we'd stepped into a postcard. Each new place we visited brought its own kind of magic. In the Amalfi Coast, we took long drives along the cliffs, the Mediterranean stretching out endlessly before us. In Vienna, we wandered through grand palaces and shared pastries in tiny cafes. In Santorini, we watched the sunset from a rooftop, the sky ablaze with colors I didn't think could exist. And through it all, Eva was there, her laughter filling the quiet spaces, her presence grounding me in a way I'd never experienced before. As Eva and I continued our journey, life took on a rhythm I'd never experienced before. A blend of freedom and stability, spontaneity and comfort. The motorhome became more than just a vehicle. It was our home, our sanctuary. Everything about this new chapter felt right, like it was exactly where I was supposed to be. Eva and I fell into a natural partnership on the road. She was the planner, always researching the best spots to visit, the hidden gems most tourists missed. I handled the logistics, driving, keeping track of expenses, making sure we had everything we needed. We joked that she was the dreamer and I was the practical one, but the truth was, we balanced each other perfectly. The days blurred together in the best way. We'd wake up early to the sound of birds outside the motorhome, sip coffee while watching the sunrise, and then hit the road, ready to see what the day had in store. Some nights, we parked in quiet countryside spots, surrounded by nothing but fields and stars. Other times, we'd find ourselves in bustling cities, exploring until our legs ached and collapsing into bed, exhausted but happy. It wasn't just the places we visited that made the journey special. It was the way Eva and I grew together. Traveling like this stripped away all the distractions, leaving just the two of us. We talked about everything, our hopes, our fears, the things that kept us up at night. I shared parts of myself I'd never told anyone, and Eva did the same. One night, while we were parked near a secluded beach in Portugal, Eva asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. Do you ever think about what it means to be happy? I didn't answer right away. Happiness was something I'd thought a lot about over the past few months. For so long, I'd equated it with having a stable life, a perfect marriage, and a clear plan for the future. But that version of happiness had fallen apart, and what I'd found with Eva was something entirely different. I think I'm starting to figure it out, I finally said. Happiness isn't about having everything figured out. It's about moments like this. Feeling content, feeling free, knowing that the person next to you is someone you can trust with everything. Eva smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. I think you're right, she said softly. That night, as we lay side by side, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of the past, the anger and hurt from Dolores' betrayal. But with Eva, that weight didn't feel so heavy anymore. Of course, there were still moments when the past crept back in. It wasn't something I could erase completely, and I wasn't sure I ever would. But those moments were becoming less frequent, less overwhelming. With Eva, I felt like I could face them without letting them define me. As the weeks went on, I realized something else. The life I was living now wasn't just an escape from the pain of the past. It was the life I'd always dreamed of, even before Dolores. Traveling, exploring, building something real with someone who truly cared for me. It was everything I'd ever wanted but had been too scared to pursue. For the first time, I wasn't running from something. I was running toward a future that felt wide open, filled with possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what that future might hold. Our journey continued, and with each passing week, Eva and I grew more comfortable in the life we were building together. What started as a leap of faith, traveling across Europe in a beat-up motorhome, had become something that felt like a true partnership. We eventually reached the Dolomites in northern Italy, a place Eva had been dying to visit. The towering peaks, jagged and majestic, felt almost otherworldly. We parked the motorhome near a small village nestled in the valley, surrounded by rolling green hills. It was the kind of place that seemed like it belonged in a fairy tale. One morning, we decided to hike one of the trails that wound its way up into the mountains. It was a crisp, clear day, and the higher we climbed, the more stunning the views became. Eva was in her element, snapping pictures every few minutes, her excitement infectious. As we reached the summit, the world seemed to open up around us. The valleys stretched out endlessly below, dotted with tiny villages and winding rivers. We stood there for a while, taking it all in, the wind tugging at our jackets. Eva turned to me, her cheeks flushed from the climb. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "This is what I've always dreamed of. Moments like this." I couldn't help but smile. "Me too," I admitted. It hit me then, standing on that mountaintop, just how far I'd come. A year ago, I was stuck in a life that felt like it had no direction. I'd been hurt, betrayed, and unsure if I'd ever find happiness again. But now, I was here, sharing this incredible moment with someone who had brought so much light back into my life. As we hiked back down, Eva brought up something we hadn't talked about much before: the future. "What do you think happens after all this?" she asked, gesturing to the mountains around us. "After we've seen everything we want to see?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, not because I didn't want to think about the future, but because I was scared of losing the freedom we'd found on the road. Still, I knew we couldn't live like this forever. At some point, we'd need to figure out what came next. "I'm not sure," I admitted. but I think we'll know when the time comes. For now, I just want to enjoy this." Eva nodded, and that was enough. We didn't need to have all the answers right away. We had time to figure it out together. That night, as we sat by a small campfire near the motorhome, Eva surprised me with an idea. "What if we don't stop?" she said, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. "What if we find a way to keep this going, to make traveling our life instead of just a chapter in it?" It was bold, even a little crazy, but it fit her perfectly. And the more we talked about it, the more it started to feel possible. With her background in teaching and my skills as a translator, there were ways we could make it work. Teaching languages online, taking on freelance projects, maybe even documenting our travels in a blog or vlog. The idea of turning our journey into a lifestyle was exciting, but it also came with its own challenges. It wasn't something we could decide overnight, but it gave us a new goal to work toward. As the fire crackled and the stars shone brightly above us, I realized that the life I was living now wasn't just a dream. It was the start of something real, something I never thought I'd find again. It's strange how life works out sometimes. If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be here, living this life, I wouldn't have believed it. Not because I didn't want it, but because it seemed so far out of reach. Yet here I was, parked on a cliffside in Santorini, the Aegean Sea shimmering below, Eva by my side. The air was warm and salty, the kind of air that wraps around you like a gentle hug. Our motorhome sat just a few feet away, our little home that had carried us through vineyards, mountains, and cities we used to only dream about. Eva was sitting cross-legged on a blanket, sketching something in a notebook, a habit she'd picked up during our travels. I leaned back, the sun kissing my face, and closed my eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, my mind wasn't weighed down by the past. There were no flashes of anger or bitterness, no lingering thoughts about what had been taken from me. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, like a story I'd read once but had long since closed. Instead, my mind was filled with the present. With Eva's laughter as she teased me about my terrible Greek pronunciation. With the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. With the sight of the sun sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I realized I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. Not the kind of happiness that comes and goes, tied to fleeting moments, but the kind that settles in your chest and makes you feel alive. Eva looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at me, that smile that always made me feel like I was the luckiest guy in the world. "You look like you're miles away," she said, her voice soft and teasing. "Not miles," I replied, sitting up and reaching for her hand. "Just here. Completely here." And I meant it. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing something or running from something. I was exactly where I wanted to be, where I'd always dreamed of being, traveling, exploring, living freely, and sharing it all with someone who made everything better just by being there. The road ahead was still open, and that was the best part. There were still places we wanted to see, things we wanted to do, dreams we hadn't even thought to dream yet. But for now, in this moment, there was nowhere else I wanted to be. Eva leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there in silence, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear. I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of peace that was almost overwhelming. This was it. This was the life I had always imagined but never thought I could have. And now that I did, I wasn't going to let anything take it away. In that moment, under the Santorini sky with the woman I loved, I knew one thing for sure. I was happier than I had ever been, happier than I ever thought possible.